Okay, thanks for those comments, David. I was wondering about, well, I mean, you started off talking about Norman Finkelstein, and I was wondering about how the issues that you discussed later on about this return to formalism, especially in English departments, how that's related to the tenure system, and might what you're saying about the sort of disciplinary backlash be related to concerns about the tenure system, because often people who can dictate the directions of departments are often senior professors who were trained in methodologies that had currency, when they first became tenured professors.
Yeah, look, one doesn't want to overstate the case. I mean, I don't think that the tenure system is about to erode, although there have been attacks on it, and there have been restrictions on it in various sorts of ways. The tenure system has always been used as a mode of constraint and, to some degree, disciplining in both senses of the term. And as long as it exists, will continue to be, right? So, I mean, Toby and I had a brief exchange last night about whether we ever paid attention to getting tenure in our own work. And interestingly enough, for both of us, we did what we wanted to do, and tenure followed, right? And I'm not saying don't pay attention to the tenure, to tenure and tenurability, but don't let it dictate your life either, because you give up an awful lot when you do that. And I think the tenure system, quite frankly, and to be blunt about it, is mixed. I think one should admit that it has, even as it has sustained the possibility of being able to think freely in that Derridian sort of way, right? It has also produced, to some degree, a lack of creative thinking for some people, a set of real constraints that people place on each other, and so on. And if you look, at some places, somebody very close to me works in a PhD program at a quite experimental university where there is no tenure. There are 2-year contracts. And it has worked marvelously well. Right, it's been creative, productive, sustaining of each other's work. There's no resting on laurels and so on and so on by anybody, but it takes a certain disposition, which of course could change at any moment in time. Somebody might come in and completely undermine it. I mean, HISCON's experience in the past few years has demonstrated this, right? I mean, an absolutely historically important department, that it just took a few people to change the sensibility of, without going further into it, and it will outlive it because it's important enough, and it will transform over time. But so I think the legacy is mixed. And it's one of the ways to think in relation to attacks. There are at least 2 different ways to respond. One is to take the attack head on, and the other is to see how you can undercut the attack by working around it, right? And very often solutions are more readily available by working around things than by taking them head on, although sometimes one has to take them head on. I'm not denying.
When I came to the University of California, it was to take over what had been a successful but small program, i.e. an academic entity that doesn't have sovereignty over its hiring, called Film and Visual Culture. It had quite a lot of majors, about 100 majors, but it didn't have any faculty, full-time or part-time, and it existed on the kindness of strangers, of faculty who did double duty and hiring adjuncts. And when I arrived, it was to make a new department. I got advice from Dan Schiller, whose name was invoked yesterday by John Hartley, and who's a very close friend and collaborator of Zal's, and also a friend of mine, and of course a friend of Liberty's. And Dan's father was Herbert Schiller, the founder of media imperialism theory, and still a byword. If you go almost anywhere in the third world and you say that you knew Herbert Schiller or you use his work, you're spoken to with a reverence rarely accorded any US academic. To give you an example of how important he was, during the struggle against the Vietnam War, the Waterside Workers' Federation in Australia, a longshore persons union, brought him out to speak against the war. The first person they brought out since Paul Robeson in the 40s. That's the kind of stature that he has. In this country, of course, barely remembered, but probably the most important media studies scholar the United States has produced. Herb was brought out to start communication studies at UC San Diego in the 60s, but the FBI had a file on him. He had been red-baited during the McCarthy period. There were spies at the University of Illinois where he'd been amongst the faculty. All of this is available on Freedom of Information. The names are redacted, but you can read about the files and the informers in the university system. So he comes to UCSD at a time when the university is in formation, at a time when the idea is to have colleges that are non-hierarchical, when third world students have gathered together and they created what became Patrice Lumumba College, where Chicano activism is at a high point. And he also is there to establish a program. What happened to Herb, much more dramatic and important than me, is that they just wouldn't let him hire anybody. They wouldn't let him, even though it became the most popular major in 10 minutes, had hundreds of students within a year or so, he couldn't form the department. And so Dan, his son, said to me when I was thinking of coming out here, get a department straight away or they'll do to you what they did to my father, right? And I talked a lot to David and others, and so as some of you who are at UCR may be aware, most of my energies went into trying to get a department straight away. This was voted down vociferously and unpleasantly by the academic senate, i.e. other members of faculty. And I didn't know why, because we'd spent a long time producing a 100-page document explaining what media and cultural studies were, how valuable they were, how they could exist. But lots and lots and lots of committees made up of my colleagues had said that this shouldn't go ahead, that it wasn't real knowledge, that it wasn't acceptable, that we didn't need it, and so on. And the chair of the academic senate came to me and said, you need to understand that all these reasons that have been mounted are actually not real. It's against you. They don't want you. No need to take this personally. Most of these people have never even met you, right? But they don't want somebody like you having power in the university. So the thing you have to do is pretend that all their arguments are legitimate, answer them, and then they'll actually vote in favor because you've been humiliated in public. So that meant people like David and lots of very senior folks right across the liberal arts, humanities and social sciences here and in other countries were sent by me a revised, this time 135-page memo about why we should become a department. And were asked to write, and they did, often in turning around on a dime, 3 to 5 page letters saying why this was kosher, why this was legitimate. So the amount of labor that is required for something as trivial and absurd as that is absolutely incredible. And, I owe an enormous debt to David and lots of other leading intellectuals in this country and elsewhere. That's what it can take. And it can be, because these people have so much power because they're tenured, as trivial as this person was brought in with all these lines to hire and all this apparent power, he must be humiliated. Or it can be much, in a sense, politically more significant, as in Herb Schiller's gone around the world talking against the US war in Vietnam and against US racism and imperialism. He will never be able to make hires. Zal, you might want to say something.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, just talk about it because I was at that department where Herbert Schiller is. And I kind of jump ahead because in the Herbert Schiller case, the fact that he was hired by the UCSD in the first place has something to do with the involvement of students challenging the university administration in terms of governance. They want something to say in terms of definition of the field. So that's why he was hired by UCSD in the first place. It was because the students demand they have a say. So like the third question that we're supposed to discuss today, the relation between institution and text, that we can also translate into the context of university. That is, the institution, the way the institution is set up, the role students, graduate students have to play in decision making, including in higher committees, including in
Sorry, they're all drunks that just need to drink hydrated.
yeah. So that itself is one of the aspects. And so in this case, the text can be understood as the positions they define, and the institution process policy making. So also another aspect. You're talking about the institutional aspect of the Herbert Schiller situation, where he had to basically didn't have the opportunity to form a program until somebody was brought in to balance him. But also, that's again a story told to me by Dan. It's the reason that Herbert Schiller his work was so influential is because he was able to write in a style that most people can read. In a sense, the ordinary people, the vernacular. If you read his books, academic books, he's very accessible. But part of the process of, I feel, being academia is a process of making your writing increasingly impenetrable so that the ordinary people cannot understand. And so if you write something, even though very critical, but if 99% of the people in the whole world, the real people in the real world cannot understand, then you are safe. So this process of getting your credentials, writing your dissertation, and especially, learn all those, I'm not, theoretically opposing postmodern, but in the sense of using those most jargons. It's a way for us, on the one hand, to get our credential, but on the other hand, to alienate us as intellectual laborers, creative workers, from the real world, the real people, really. The ideas, now, okay, because I've already been seen as a party apparatus, let me be a Mao. Mao said, ideas won't have power unless it becomes the, in the minds of people. And so this process is a dynamic that we need to master. That is, you need to have enough academic vocabulary to pass your committees, pass your tenure, but at the same time, how you still manage being somebody who can write something that's accessible. And they should actually told me that how Herbert Schiller paid for the kind of things he write. Even though, when he was hired at UC San Diego, he was already had tenure, but for many years, they just dismissed his work as not being academic enough. If you don't have a million footnotes, or if you don't write in language that's accessible, that's, obscure.
So that was Norman Finkelstein's problem. Dershowitz could actually understand him.
Just one more thing, talk about Herbert Schiller, and also again, media institution. You talk about how Derrida received a obituary from New York Times, right? Herbert Schiller was officially, actually, banned by the New York Times to be interviewed. Right, Toby? And then when he passed away, New York Times published a very glowing obituary on him. That's how I guess New York Times gained legitimacy. Because he can't reply anymore, he can't be quoted anymore.
And if Herb's case does interest you, Rick wrote a terrific book about Herb, plus Schiller's last book, his posthumous book, with the wonderful title "Living in the Number One Country," is extremely moving.
So just before we circulate again, let me just add a couple of things. I had a funny thought. My most sobering moment this morning was when I realized I was the oldest person at the party last night. Right? But that aside, just yeah, Alejandro wasn't there. Damn. Two thoughts, maybe not so quick, but the one is a thought about institutional formation and their temporality. I've long observed that interesting, and maybe not so interesting, but certainly interesting institutional forms, centers, institutes, research formations, and so on, have normally usually have about a 10-year lifespan. 3 or 4 years to build up, to get the support for it, to get the kind of institutional interactions and engagements together. 3 or 4 years of running smoothly, right? And then 3 or whatever years of decline. So it's sort of up, like, up, level off, and then down. And you can look at many institutional sites, both departments and otherwise, for this. And so the trick is that before the 10 years are up, that there be a transformation in leadership, if not in leadership, certainly in thinking about what the institution or the institutional site stands for, right? How it transforms itself in relation to the prevailing both intellectual and structural or material conditions in place today. I think it's an extremely important, if somewhat simplistic way of thinking about institutional apparatuses and so on. So that's and the trick is timing. So when to think that you've got to move to another way of doing things or another way of thinking about things. So that's the first thing. The second is in relation, is maybe more particular to your own circumstance and goes back to the, in some ways, a question of tenure, but maybe more, even more pressingly of training, sort of at the graduate level. Thinking about my own career and many others, the more provocative one's work, the more likely it is that you're going to have people who will oppose you, whether they're colleagues, fellow students, or colleagues as one enters the academy, or even in other professors who don't like the work that you're doing or don't like who you're working with, and so on. Again, don't be cowed by all of this. I think it's extremely important to figure out the various ways, and there really are various ways, in which you can engage the people you find most important to enable your work, right, as you're doing it. And when I say there are various ways, there are all kinds of restrictions, like you've got to have so many people from your department on your committee, or you've got to have so many people from this arrangement or that arrangement, and so on. Look very carefully at those things and see if there are precedents for getting around them. There are always workarounds. I mean, I joke about the University of California. For every rule, there's a rule to break the rule or to get around the rule, right? And you just need to know what those are in order to be, and I'm sure most other institutions are like that too. So you just need to figure out how you reconstruct, right, at best for yourself, the sets of arrangements that you can put to work the people you want to work with, who will support you, sometimes by leaving you alone, but sometimes by pushing you, right? And both those things throughout your dissertation writing, certainly, and maybe your broader education, are equally important at different moments. Sorry, there was Eric.
Yeah, I just had a question as a UC Irvine student. Well, actually, first I had a comment. There was a guy, a scholar named Chris Newfield, I think from UCSB, I want to say.
English UCSB.
Who's done, book Ivy and Industry, and the second part's coming out. A lot of it's about, he did a presentation at a conference this past quarter, and it had a lot of numbers, really detailed numbers and charts on the UC budgeting and various really interesting, sort of challenging data about assumptions that, the sciences or various other technology, et cetera, that receive tons of support from industry, and it's part of the logic that Schwarzenegger uses to cut various budgets.
Chris's work is about the neoliberalization, in particular of the University of California, but about the academy in general over the last 30 years. And I mean, he very savvy. He became the chair of the budget committee of the whole of the University of California, and he stole the numbers. I mean, didn't steal them, but he had access to the numbers, and so he has incredible data.
What's his last name?
Newfield, Christopher Newfield. Great book.
Yeah, and I think it's out this year, maybe, I want to say. Yeah. So anyways, and then the question I had was just, as somebody that's somewhat, I don't mean for this to be sort of obscure or irrelevant to people that aren't in the English department here. But as an example, with talking.
Careful now, you're on camera. You might want to turn this off.
Well, just talking with Jerry, Christensen, there was some.
Until the end of this last year, the chair of English.
Yeah, sorry. There was some issue about I guess and I'm not entirely informed on this, so that's why it's a question. But that the Complet students sort of got deprioritized for some funding because Jerry, as the head of the English department, felt that he, in that institutional role, had to look out for English students first and then the MFAs second, and Complet just wasn't his responsibility.
Yeah, it's a long, complex history, but I mean that's basically right. We probably shouldn't discuss it in this forum.
Well, the point that I sort of wanted to make was that this was all sort of coming about in the context of the class with which the Chris Newfield presentation conference was associated, and one of the points that Dr. Zalay, the professor here that sort of was one of the co-sponsors of the conference, was making was that interdisciplinary organizations sound really great from a conceptual standpoint, but that in sort of the history of the university over the past 40 years, they do play into that sort of flexibilization of labor that exposes it weakens disciplinary solidarity and exposes you to some of the whims and vagaries of the institutional budgeting processes and various things along those lines that are really just sort of making one more precarious within that sort of. And so I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that from a UCHRI being an interdisciplinary organization and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, so you pose an interesting general question. I think a simple response would be to say that the institution structurally at heart, the academy institutionally at heart, remains very profoundly and for some important reasons, profoundly disciplinarily underpinned, right? I mean, disciplines have not gone away and won't be going away anytime soon. And the institutional power is predicated on those disciplinary formations. The very notion of interdisciplinarity is predicated on the assumption of the continued existence of disciplines. I mean, otherwise, why call it interdisciplinarity? Right? So the question then becomes: so what is the relation of the interdiscipline to what is the between? Do interdisciplinary programs or formations or departments now increasingly, and departments are not the same as disciplines, of course, so you can have interdisciplinary departments, right? What is the relation of the interdisciplinary to the disciplinary in the creation of training, right, or in training as such? I've always said to students of mine who have come to me and say, we're more interested in the kind of interdisciplinary questions that are posed and so on, that one should still be very careful about training oneself at least in the methodological and disciplinary questions and issues of at least a single discipline, even as one is doing and engaged with interdisciplinary work, as a kind of hedge against these sets of concerns. I'm not sure about Chalay's argument, quite frankly. I'm not sure how deeply. I'm not sure that you can blame interdisciplinarity for the for the increased vulnerability, if not too flexible labor. And precariousness, or to those things as such, not just to the vulnerability to it. These are much deeper, more complex questions, and I think that I think that is a position vested in a disciplinary interest of maintenance, right, rather than a convincing response. I mean, it is to presuppose that interdisciplinarity already makes you vulnerable, right? Which is not necessarily the case, right?
Can I just jump in there? 'Cause one of the things people should know is that the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, the most important drivers in many ways of how Research One universities work, are 100% behind interdisciplinarity. They're totally opposed to disciplines. And they are constantly trying to get universities to become more interdisciplinary. They're constantly trying to break down differences between professional associations. They punish rabbit warrens of morons like political science by taking away lots of their money because they refuse to play well with others. So at the level of people who are actually trying to drive knowledge forward and who are looking at all the international points of comparison, nodes of comparison, and as I said, animating the funding, it's clear that the disciplinary model simply doesn't work. You can't know enough on your own. You can't know enough within one discipline. It isn't. It just isn't an issue at that level.
Yeah,
and yet,
I agree.
what David and others are saying about how many universities work is still true. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing was about the question of labour. It's very clear that those of us who are what are called ladder faculty in the University of California system, who are on a line to get tenure in a Research One school, really do so increasingly on the backs of adjunct and sessional and graduate student labour, however you define it. Now, of course, some people who are in those situations wish to have that kind of employment at one point in their life or in general. But nevertheless, the number of jobs that are ongoing and guaranteed in the United States Research Academy is diminishing as a proportion of the amount of labour required to deliver teaching, administration, and research. It's a simple fact. It's applying almost everywhere. And one of the things that can come up, and this is not to buy into the idea that cultural studies aids job losses, but it is a factor that lots of people have experienced. You are a dean. You have the following situation. The classics professor has dropped dead. In her last quarter, she taught 4 people. The medievalist has gone to Indiana because they have more hanging manuscripts to stare at. You have an increasingly racially diverse student body that is saying, we're sick of dwems, we don't want to animate more dead white European males, we want queer faculty, we want faculty of colour and so on. Aha, I've just had a 60-year-old drop dead whose fringe costs plus salary are $120,000 a year. I've just had a 50-year-old, well, let's make it older than me, a 53-year-old illuminated manuscript fetishist go to Indiana. That's $115,000. Why don't I find a lesbian of colour who's an assistant professor who will satisfy these requirements of cultural studies animations amongst the student body and amongst the other faculty, who can serve on lots of committees and provide gender and racial diversity, right? And these calculations really go on. So we're saving ourselves
$250,000.
$250,000. We're getting somebody who's going to do a lot more work and who is going to still discontent.
And who's cool.
Well, yeah, I don't think they care about that. But this means that the sort of additional emotional labour that so many women in the academy are called upon to do, and so many minority faculty in the academy and queer faculty are called upon to do compared to us, but gets exacerbated monumentally through that kind of calculation. And it's a very real question that some of you will have experienced, and it's not only for women and not only for queer faculty, but anybody in those cross-hatched categories of subjectification gets these expectations put on them institutionally, and it does become a bit of a quick fix at times.
There's one more thing to be said in response to Eric's question, that is, what are the questions that are posed out of a disciplinary formation, and how do they differ from the questions that are posed in interdisciplinary formations? What are the distinctions that one can draw between the different kinds of formations? Is it the case that interdisciplinary work is more driven by thematics, by posing of problems, right, whereas disciplines are driven by much more narrowly constrained sets of questions that relate to sets of questions that have been asked traditionally within the discipline over usually quite long periods of time. And so one keeps on coming back to those questions, even if in differently or reposed kinds of ways. So, and which might be the constraint exactly because one is not interested, if you're in that discipline, you may not be interested in that narrow posing of the question, right? You want to open it up to other sets of interrogation.
I was just going to add a point to the question of interdisciplinarity, being in an interdisciplinary program that's managed to survive past 10 years, right? Thank goodness. Hopefully a little bit longer. I think people often confuse interdisciplinarity with the mixing up of methods, like, I need new methods. And I think I was really glad to hear David say it's important while you're in an interdisciplinary program to train, to discipline yourself, to know a discipline. So basically so you can know when you're being disciplined. I mean, that is the key, at least in my department, right? Like we compare different ways of being disciplined and then try and find ways to work around it because we come from different, knowledge formations or whatever. And as, things are changing via the creative industries or whatever. I mean, we talked about this last week, the way workforces are being differently disciplined, differently exploited, whatever. I mean, this is the work of interdisciplinarity. It's not just mixing methods, but looking critically at how we're being disciplined, right?
Yeah. The additional thing to be said as well is that no matter the discipline, certainly in the humanities, the history of its formation, I mean, the history of consciousness being a case in point, right? The history of its formation is crucial to understanding what that discipline is about. So it's already either recursively interdisciplinary or just straightforwardly interdisciplinary and recursively in relation to history itself, right? But if it's not history, then invoking the historical in order to understand itself becomes an opening up. So the disciplinary is itself constitutively not narrowly constrained, if you think of it in those terms. Right? Yeah.
So I'd like to pose the question maybe in a slightly different way, as a problem that many of us face in the ways in which we are trying to work across various kinds of knowledge formations, and that is the challenge to be trained fully in some particular kind of discipline, to really have a grasp of a lot of a strong methodological approach or a variety of methodological approaches, and then to be able to reach out, into a variety of different places and connect information across, so that it becomes a tremendous amount of work to do to be proficient, let alone fluent, in all of the different spaces. And so I face, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, this challenge of, well, okay, I have X number of years that I'm supposed to get this, PhD done in, and I need to know, there's not just 3 or 4 fields that I have to be fluent in, but there's many, 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 many more. Because when I say I'm working on, history and memory, okay, well, there's that. Then there's also time, right? Okay, then also, and that's all like one thing, one component. But those are like really 3 separate things. And then on the other hand, then there's all these other pieces that I work on. There's not just, history of the family, there's sociology of the family, there's kinship studies. And so becoming fluent in all of these things in order to do a really good interdisciplinary project, and this is parallel to the problem of transnational work, right? Which has been discussed a lot, not necessarily, and so what kind of solutions can we come up with as people who are working in a knowledge industry, to how it is that we go about our labor and produce the things that we produce in such a way is that we are not in a way that we can still maintain healthy lives and doing good work. Because I think that part of the move, I'm guessing, the part of the move towards, and I don't want to valorize it or endorse it, a new formalism is a desire to get away from the pressure of having to know everything about everything in order to publish a book. Any ideas on that?
Yes, the burdens are great of interdisciplinary work. The question, as I think any good dissertation advisor would advise you, is to bite off something you can actually manage, and to narrow one's question down. Writing a dissertation is not the last thing you will do if you want to be an academic, or a writer for that matter. Right? It's the first step in a very long process of writing a range of things, not all of which needs to be said or should be said in one's dissertation. Yeah.
I have a question about the humanities as useful in general education. And my question is, who are today's engineers? If in the sort of 50s, after the Second World War, that there was a perceived need to train moral engineers so they wouldn't sort of reproduce sort of
The atom bomb.
Yeah, exactly.
The atom bomb.
Then, and that was a moment in which sort of instruction in the tenets of the humanities was especially about sort of moral behavior. And I'm wondering now, with the new economy that we've seen emerge and that we've been talking about, what students are the new engineers that universities are attending to as having similar needs, or are sort of tomorrow's knowledge workers not seen as having that need that the humanities can address?
It's a complex question, because I mean part of the debate that has been going on in the academy at large is, as the humanities is seen to shrink, the humanities and the arts actually are seen to be to shrink and be less relevant. Is the transformation in some circles of universities into professional training. Right. So part of the debate has been the tension between professional training centers, right, or institutions on the one hand, and the production of critically, if not critically thinking citizens, whether engineers or scientists or artists or humanists and so on. I mean, that has been the kind of debate that has been ongoing, and most university leaders will respond, well, of course the university needs to be addressing issues beyond the narrow scope of technical or professional training, right? And so the humanities are absolutely necessary. I mean, it used to be the case that that people would say you couldn't have a university without having a philosophy department. That gave way really in the 1980s. I mean, the philosophy departments started to get marginalized within the institution quite dramatically. In some cases were closed, but certainly in some cases were just scaled back. In part having to do with what I started 2 weeks ago by saying, was that philosophers were really talking largely only to each other, and were seen not to have a relevance in training for a complex citizenship, right? And the debate certainly within and across the University of California over the last 10 years has been how one thinks of the humanities in relation to producing that sense of cultural literacy in all its complexities, linguistic, moral or ethical, cultural in every sense of the term, and indeed in technological terms as well, right? So thinking about technology and its uses is not simply a technological issue, right, by a long stretch of the imagination. And so it requires a certain set of critical relation to the technology to understand its place, what it enables, what it disables, what it presupposes in terms of resource requirement, distraction, management, and so on and so forth, in a way that Toby and certainly Rick earlier on sort of
I'm still stuck in this return to formalism, and I'm wondering, I guess what I'm wondering is if it also reflects, in a wider sense, a kind of shift towards a kind of hermeticism, and a kind of siege mentality in terms of the relationship between academia and the rest of society. And I'm wondering if this also reflects a kind of shutting down of avenues where, I know the term public intellectual is kind of a contested one, but I wonder if this reflects a kind of shutting down of avenues where one can be a public intellectual. I'm thinking of, you mentioned Norman Finkelstein, but I'm also thinking about, I think what Angela McRobbie said earlier when she talked about, how sort of publishing in newspapers is not really seen as real sort of academic work. And I'm partly saying this because I thought it was interesting to see Michael Keith yesterday in the role he played. But also I find that sometimes it can be easier to slip into this binary where either you're an academic who speaks only to other academics, or you're someone like Richard Florida, and there's no other position you can occupy. And as someone who is trying to think of other ways, other kinds of, who's trying to think of other positions, either than the two ends of that binary. I'm wondering about this turn to kind of formalism in relation to this, and I feel it also raises these kind of disturbing questions about the relationship between academia and the rest of society, and kind of our role as as academics or as critics or whatever.
Yeah, I think those are sharp remarks. I think one could say is that two things that maybe pull in different directions. I mean, the first is that there are Michael Keith provides one way of intermediating between those various positionalities, but there are, I think, any number of other expressions of it. I think of friends and colleagues. I mean, Josh Kuhn would be a way, I think, of operating within the public sphere, even as is an academic and intellectual, right? That's very different from the kind of model that Michael operates. And there are others you can point to as well. I mean, there are people who engage in policy debates. There are people who, whether in the sciences or in the humanities, who, people like Larry Smarr and so on, who runs a major technology institute at the University of California, and so on and so forth, who are operating at various registers in and outside the academy, in and outside the public sphere, and so on. So that's the first thing. The second has to do with the question of formalism more directly. I think what it is a carving out of a position that is peculiarly and constitutively that is seen to be, I don't know that it is, that is seen to be of and for and in the interests of the humanities in its own terms within the academy, the implications and effects of which are exactly what you point them out to be, namely a closing down of the possibility of an engagement outside of itself. But I think it would represent itself as speaking in and on its own terms, in and for itself, and nothing else, right? And then the implications and effects become debatable.
Okay, a couple of reflections on the public intellectual point and then something else. I think that one of the issues is about the demand, is that there's clearly a demand for that role of the kind of public intellectual. The difficulty is outside of the academy, it's very hard to get paid for it. I mean, there are basically two ways of doing it. You're either Christopher Hitchens, and you're a journalist, and you effectively make your living from being a journalist, or you're Richard Dawkins, and you don't make your living from selling books on atheism. You make your living by being paid by the University of Oxford for being a professor. So it's actually about a simpler matter as how do you get an income from being a sort of public intellectual, I think. But I think there are lots of contradictory things going on, because it seems to me that there is a demand in the sale of those kind of books, that kind of work. There's clearly a kind of demand in the sort of public sphere for those kind of works. And even something like philosophy, I was really interested in your points about philosophy departments closing down, because it seems to me that popular philosophy writing is undergoing something of a kind of renaissance. And there's a sort of demand for it, and there's philosophy on, well, in the UK anyway, on TV and on the radio and in The Guardian, in a way that there wasn't 10 years ago. So I think that the questions of the kind of self and how do we live are actually in a strange way
closing
very
down
popular.
20 years ago. I didn't mean closing down now.
Right, okay, but it seems to be...
But they narrowed down.
They may be, but there is still a sort of public hunger for these kind of discussions, as in the whole Dawkins, Hitchens, atheism, faith kind of debate. Was sort of, nobody would have predicted the sales of those kind of books. So there's clearly a sort of an audience and a market for those kind of things. But it is the issue of how do you get paid for these things, I think, is a real one. And the other one that we haven't really talked about here is about disciplines in the academy. Nobody's really mentioned the non-academic labour market as a disciplining kind of device in this at all. So this is kind of carried on as if there was no labour markets in the world other than the academic labour market that actually mattered in terms of what people study at university. And one of the issues, I think there's two, again, I think, contradictory things going on, because just before I came out, the Video Games Designers Trade Association in the UK published a report saying, stop training people in video games design. We don't like them. We want people who've done physics, maths, or philosophy. That's what we want. We want proper structured thinkers in disciplines that we recognise. We don't want them to have done video games or video game studies or anything like that, because we don't buy it. So one of the reasons that interdisciplinarity, I think, is problematic is because of the effects of the labour market, that employers will repeatedly say, I don't want someone who's done queer studies, I want someone who's done English, because English is a degree that I recognise the name of, and it's the kind of thing that people taught when I was at university. So I think there's a whole issue about how the sort of wider labour market plays into this as well. Point. But also there is this issue about, I was thinking about this when John was talking yesterday, this sort of notion that what the academy should do is train people for the labour market is actually often resisted by people in the labour market who say, don't give me people who've done video games, give me philosophers.
I mean, that is not a recent response from a certain segment of the labour market, right? So that you've had, you've had businesses or financial organisations and so on, often asking for those trained in philosophy precisely because they're able to analyse things in a clear-minded way. Right, exactly.
Just before we go to Juan for the last question, we're going to break into groups after Juan's question and David's and whoever's response. And I'll tell you about that after he's said what he's going to say. But I just wanted to note that I think it's time we...
This could be perfect framing for what I want to say, or could be the moment where you pay no attention to what I want to say because you're already thinking of that. So I want you to choose the first one, okay?
But isn't that the dilemma for any question?
It is, as we know. I want to go back to the way in which David framed this, and I want to go back to the beginning of the conversation we had, David and myself, at the beginning of this seminar. Because David started talking about basically free speech and the rights of academics to think freely in a society that is more and more coming down on them to constrain free speech and free thinking especially. And there is a whole lot more, and I'm sure David could tell us more about how crucial that freedom is and how important it is to feel invested in being able to think without having to curtail that thinking because of practical considerations of the limiting kind. But I want to go to political considerations that are not of the limiting kind, but are of the challenging and enabling kind. Okay, so politics is certainly a sphere that limits what can be said or thought, because there are structures of powers and institutions that are structuring power hierarchies that you have to deal with. But politics can also be the place where intellectuals connect with communities. And so it is to this latter aspect of politics that I want to refer to, because I want to lead us to a different reading of the crisis of the university, which is directly connected to the genealogy you established, but adds to it, in my view, and allows you to make a different diagnosis of how to answer the question about the crisis of the humanities. It is undoubtedly the case that the humanities are in crisis because, in some sense, they have lost the traditional subject for which they were always the form of cultural capital that endowed either a cultural varnish or some kind of fundamental linguistic skills that allow the work of nation building or imperialism. The work that deconstruction does in inscribing difference at the center of identity or on the margins of identities, creating the figure of incompletude, of incompleteness, is fundamental to where I want to get. But we should also remember that for some 15 or 20 years, deconstruction became in the US the form of formalism that resisted political economy and Marxism in US universities. So that the specificity of any particular thought is very much enmeshed, not simply with the ideas that it's proposing, but also with the forms of particular deployment and institutional deployment in which it happens. So that's an aside. But what I want to get at is this. The subject of the humanities, the universal subject of the humanities, the masculine, white, Western subject of the humanities is put in crisis. And it's not put in crisis because thought exclusively puts it in crisis, but it's put in crisis because the third world wakes up at some point and says, enough. And it is decolonizing processes that allow us to think of the limits of that Western white masculine subject. And it is feminism that allows us to do that. But then it's feminism of color that allows us to say, hey, there is something that is being left out here. In that trajectory, what we're faced with, I would contend, is interculturality at the very heart of the university today and at the very heart of the humanities. Interculturality in the way in which it has to respond. Interculturality, by the way, understood as basically the friction produced among those who are different, but may have equal rights. And that friction is produced both in the third world and in the first world at the point of contact between first world and third world within each one of this. Interculturality for us is to go to a restaurant and the fact that everybody who is cooking and invisible is Mexican or Salvadorian, while we are having access to a multicultural dinner. That is to say, to a dinner that confirms us as contemporary, informed, culturally aware people, while the labor of those who are producing the meal is being invisibilized. It is to those kids, the daughters, the sons of those people, that I want to teach. Not exclusively, mind you, because then it wouldn't be intercultural. I want to put them in dialogue with these other kids who are the sons and the daughter of the mostly Asian, East Asian, or white parents who are professionals and doing really well and can actually have that dinner. So I conceive of my classroom as the space where that form of interculturality happens, and I would rather thematize it than hide it. So if you think of the university in crisis now, then it's in crisis because we have to wonder for what communities is this university useful? For what subjects is this knowledge useful or empowering? And what forms of empowerment is it actually providing? That is a fundamental question that can no longer be taken for granted. We saw yesterday in John Hartley's presentation, how is it that a neutralized, a completely deculturalized, depoliticized knowledge is being placed at the very heart of the enterprise of the humanities. What we need to do is to bring back the specificity of power, the specificity of culture, the specificity of race and ethnicity back into, but not as forms of, as way of studying that is outside, that is there. It is as a way of understanding who we are and the communities we live in. So if you start from interculturality and the challenges presented by this, by simply wondering for whom is this knowledge useful and for what community will this be empowering or not, and who is being disempowered by this form of knowledge. If you start from there, maybe it's a great thing that the humanities are in crisis. Because if this is the occasion to try to answer those questions with new answers, with new forms of knowledge and new forms of institutions and new types of departments, then that's great. Welcome. But we cannot insist simply on interdisciplinary knowledge without, as if knowledge could reproduce itself by itself, without any contact with the communities that it serves and from which it stems truly. interdisciplinary should come hand in hand with interculturality, because it is at that intersection of interdisciplinarity and interculturality that the real challenges of the humanities are coming, especially when we are being sold by people like Hartley the idea that technology is neutral, knowledge is neutral, we are all equal subjects, it's just an issue of access.
Look, I don't disagree with much of what you said, but I'd pose it a little differently. With implications that I think are a bit more pernicious institutionally than I think the implications, the opening up implications that you rightly want to see come about. Two premises, and then I'll sort of draw some conclusions from there, and then I'll shut up. So the first is that the university historically, at least in the last century, has been a profoundly middle-class making institution. I mean, that's been its function, right? In terms of knowledge formation, in terms of the production of subjects, in both senses of the term, in terms of the production of a workforce, and in terms of the kinds of cultural subject matter at play in the academy. I was reminded of this, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago in a hiring process where a colleague I otherwise had considerable respect for objected to a candidate from a Belgian rural family who was clear in a way the most interesting candidate in the field. I mean, he had 20 publications, including one with Habermas, and it was his first position, including 2 books and so on. And he was seen not to be a legitimate middle-class making instructor in the academy, and my colleagues, if you can call them that at the time, were convinced by this argument and excluded him from the pool in favor of a much more cloned, namely somebody more like them, legible to them, set of candidates. So that's the first premise. The second premise has a deeper historical resonance, and that is that an institution, a society that's predicated on wanting to maintain sameness presupposes a sense of itself as homogeneous, right? That there's a kind of underlying historical, long-standing homogeneity that gets disrupted by the interruptions from the external of those who are not like us coming in among us. And I think that's a profoundly mistaken view of the history of the world, to put it in short, right? That heterogeneity is always, demographically and otherwise, has always marked societies. And societies have found ways to manage and repress those forms of heterogeneity in different kinds of ways. And what happened post-1960s was a disruption of the perceived homogeneity in the society and in the academy as an expression of the society. That a society like the United States or Western societies more generally, or Western influence and influx societies more generally, then had struggled over a 20 or 30 year period to find ways to resituate its the possibilities of remaking homogeneity within the challenge to it, both from within and without, where the within and the without were no longer easily identified, right? And so to round this, to round the square, I suppose, to sort of bring the earlier discussion into this picture of things. That tension between formalism on the one hand, which you rightfully point out is a threat to any methodological and principled set of commitments, right? I mean, it has a possibility of retreating into a kind of formalism. And the interesting thing about deconstructive formalism is it still raises questions that enable the possibility of opening it up. Whereas this contemporary formalism that I'm trying to point to, I think is an attempt to close down even that set of possibilities, because the questions are only about the formal, right? And the formal apparatuses and so on. So the tension between the formal and formalistic apparatuses and commitments on the one hand, and these, I'll call it other, right, set of commitments that incipiently have been there for maybe a very long time, but certainly emerged with great energy, right, from something like the 1960s onwards, in relation to these social, political, economic, demographic shifts. If there's a crisis, it's not just of the humanities. I think technology, the contemporary technology, has posed the question to the university: what do you want to be? What do you want the institution to be? What are you training? Who are you training? How are you training them? What are you training them for? That question has been reposed contemporarily with a vigor we haven't seen for a very long time within the structure of these other sets of issues that have remained unresolved and contested across time. And I think that that set of disruptions, right, mark the academy at large, and it's been attempted to be settled in one direction rather than the other, namely in the interest of a kind of narrow technology. I mean, the formalism is connected, deeply connected, that you're seeing in the humanities, is deeply connected to a formalism that comes out of the technologically driven disciplines, even as many in those disciplines are turning to us in order to have conversations about the implications of the technological for the social. I mean, many of my most interesting conversations these days are not so much with my colleagues. I mean, the critical theory folks here are really in crisis because they don't know what to do with themselves. I mean, all the guys have died. They've gone. They're over. So where do we turn for like the next interesting thing? And maybe this afternoon I'll have a bit more to say about sort of where our turn in terms of the Critical Theory Institute is going. The more interesting conversations have been with people like Larry Smarr and Dan Atkins at NSF and other folks who are thinking complexly about the relation between the technological and the social.
Okay, thanks, David. That was great.
Thank you.